All right, welcome everybody. We're live on the YouTubes for a Devil's Advocate debate. I've got Mr. Jefferson Yakitori, who's going to be debating me, but we will be taking that off first because we're going to do some preliminary introductions. Real quick, Mr. Dunphy, I'm going to make you solo screen right now because I got to run grab something over there, so you can speak to the audience for a minute.
Did you call me Mr. Dunphy? Well, yeah, I represent the Atheism Through Truth, Reason, and Logic.edu website, and we just dismantle religious arguments and myths and Bronze Age cohort or superstitious nonsense. He already has run away because he's already lost, so yeah. I've got much more to say than theism is a mental disease and so on. And creates cognitive.
Yeah, it's unnecessary. So sorry about that, folks. So yeah, we don't actually have a ton of time. I have a bit of a schedule to keep today. We were supposed to start at 3, but obviously we had a few issues that were nobody's fault. So we're gonna try to stick to a half hour. Now, real quick, I did want to do a preliminary on this, and that's why I called you Dunphy, because I want to start this out just talking to you and kind of what your purpose is when you're behind these. Because when I portray Maxwell Yates, obviously there's a comedic element to it. I did a live stream as Maxwell Yates, and it was terrible, like the worst atheist objections you could possibly, or worst atheist arguments you could possibly think of. And so in that sense, you could say I was strawmanning the atheist, but that was for the comedic purposes. When I actually engaged in a debate, like when I had Frank Turek on, or when I had Gary Habermas on, I'm actually trying to steelman the atheist position. Now, John, there's obviously you go further with the comedic element than I do, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. So because, for example,
once in a while I'll bring up like a Graham Oppie thing.
Yeah, and then that's perfectly fine. That's obviously because I try to balance that steelman and the comedic element to it. But here's the thing: is I actually don't think there's anything wrong with what you do, because there can be complaints of strawman, but as long as you and I are recognizing that there is a hierarchy of better versus worse arguments for atheism or even for Christianity, for any worldview, really. Cameron, I think it was yesterday, did a video with William Lane Craig where they addressed it. It was a video titled The Best Arguments for Atheism, but they both said at the outset, they're like, listen, we're not actually saying these are the best arguments for atheism. Obviously, someone like Graham Oppie would make much better arguments. These are more someone just put these together as like a compilation of like insults from different comedians and whatnot. So John and I, obviously, in doing this, are recognizing that there are much better arguments, but there's a comedic element. And here's the thing: is even though there are better arguments, often when you're engaging with people, I know when I engage with my friends in college or even just in the YouTube comments, these popular level arguments come up. Although they're not sophisticated, they're very popular, unfortunately. So I do think it's useful to do what we're going to do here. But do you have any other kind of preliminary things you want to say? No? All right. And so real quick, I do have a special announcement regarding this book at the end of the stream. So stay tuned for the full half hour if you want to see that. But yeah, now we are going to jump right in to the Devil's Advocate debate. Stelman Smith Jr. versus Jefferson Yakitori. And we said this was on morality. And so I'll kind of let you take this off, or, I'll establish it.
Yeah, no, it's your claim, so.
Well, because we were just discussing briefly beforehand, you weren't saying sure which atheist position specifically you wanted to take. So that's what I was thinking.
You said atheist position. There is no position of atheism. Atheism is only the position that you're wrong.
It's only the position that I'm wrong. Okay, that works. Okay, well, here, real briefly, I'll lay out Craig's moral argument, and I'll be happy to defend that. So premise 1. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise 2, objective moral values and duties do exist. Conclusion, therefore, God exists. So the first one would essentially be to say, without any kind of transcendent anchor or grounding or, say, ontological reference, right? If there's no reference point, then what we call moral behavior or moral actions or values, they're not objective and binding on people. When you have, say, 2 statements of mathematics that contradict each other, unless there's a true standard of what would constitute right answers or say, good problem-solving mathematics. Without that ontic reference point, neither answer would be right or wrong. They'd just be different. Frank Turek often gives the example of if you have 2 maps of Scotland and they look very different, you say, well, which one of these is more like Scotland. Well, there has to be an actual reference point, Scotland. You'd have to see an actual map of Scotland to say which one is closer. Otherwise, if there was no such place as Scotland, they would just be different shapes. They wouldn't mean anything. And it's that way with morality. You have two, say moral actions. One is beating someone up and taking their money. Another is, loving your neighbors and those kinds of things. If there's no ontic reference point to judge different actions as better or worse, then they're just different. They're just relative to people. So that'd be the brief defense of the first premise. And the second premise, objective moral values and duties do exist, would just say, an atheist might bite the bullet and say, yeah, they are just relative or just the byproducts of evolution or whatever. But I would say anybody who consults their kind of internal, what would you say, their intuitions, has experience of an objective moral realm. The same way, I have experience of this table and this book. Could it all be an illusion? Could I be in the Matrix? Sure, that's possible. But at the very least, my experience of this external world is some evidence that the external world exists. And I would say also when we make free choices, that's some evidence that free will exists. And when we make moral choices and say feel morally abhorred at terrible things that we see or hear of, often atheists complain about actions in the Old Testament, how terrible it was for God to command Abraham to kill his son Isaac. When we have that kind of visceral reaction to those things, that's some evidence into a world where moral realism is true. And so then I would say from both those premises, it follows that God exists because God is the only ontic, objective, say, reference point to ground those objective moral values and duties. But you can do with that as you wish, Mr. Yakitori.
Yeah, so what's a specific moral objective value and duty you have in mind? Because I've heard this Stelman Smith Jr., yeah, that's your name, the unapologetic apologist. It's funny because apologists never defend their claims. They just go back in word salads and circular arguments and reasoning. But
I tried to.
You say there is what if just one exists and therefore God exists. So let's just work off one. What is one that you think is objective beyond human opinion?
It is evil. It is objectively evil to rape somebody.
Why?
Why? Because human life has value and dignity because we're created in the image of God. And so...
Yeah, how do you know they're created in the image of God?
Well, I have evidence for that. I have evidence for God.
Is your evidence objective morality?
No, my evidence wouldn't be objective morality. That would be, you could call that some kind of circular reason. I mean, here's the thing is, like, if you want to get into a debate of, say, the cumulative case for the truth of Christianity, that's a whole other debate we can have. That's getting off the topic of morality, though. So asking how I know we're made in the image of God is not the same thing as how I know it's objectively wrong to rape somebody. Now, it does follow if we are made in the image of God, it's objectively wrong to rape somebody. So yes, that is the grounding I'm working off of.
That's the Christian worldview, and boy, I hope you don't want to go down that route because I can bring up a lot there. Even in the Bible, it's just a bunch of... No, it wouldn't be if the Imago Dei, which is Genesis 1:28 or whatever 1:27, is your justification for human value, and human value is dependent upon why it's wrong to rape someone. Because otherwise, God could exist and not create humans in the image, the Imago Dei, and you could still be allowed to rape someone, unless you have to have a different justification for why it's wrong to rape someone and why that's an objective standard, so on, or objective moral value or duty.
Well, no, so it would be irrelevant to the case. So you asked me just one example of something that's wrong, and I pointed it out. So it would be completely irrelevant or a red herring for you just to say, well, if you hold this worldview, here's a bunch of other things I can name that are wrong. It's like, okay, fine, then more than one thing is wrong. I'm happy to go with that. But it's your burden of proof to argue, one, that morality is relative, so it's not objectively wrong to claim.
I never made that claim.
Or that
I never made that claim, though.
I'm saying you would have to defend one of two things. So you'd have to defend either that or that there's a standard beyond God or apart from God on your worldview that could ground that's
why can't I say I don't know?
It would depend on the context. Or would you say you do believe in objective morality, but you don't know the grounding?
Why can't I just claim maybe it's objective, maybe it's not objective? Why do I have to accept your claim or accept your dichotomy? Like, how do you know that's the only dichotomy, and how do you know you're right?
Oh, well, this is an argument that's often brought up by atheists. They'll say something like, I think I've actually heard it brought up in William and Craig debates before, although I can't recall which one specifically, but they'll say, well, until he's refuted every single possible naturalistic theory, whether it be utilitarianism or, you pick it. There's this book here that lays out several atheistic theories to ground morality. And they'll say, until you've refuted all of them, you can't claim that God's the objective one. But I would say, so long as you can refute a basic principle that all of them rely on, then yeah, that's perfectly fine. And so I briefly tried to do that when I defended the first premise. But I would say, yes, any naturalistic moral theory tends to just take certain principles for granted, like human life has value, or I should respect.
You're assuming I'm a naturalist. I could be a pantheist. I could be a pantheist. Well, it's your burden. I'm just giving you alternatives that you can. They metaphysically explain this objective moral value.
Well, are you willing to defend any of the alternatives?
No, I'm willing to defend that you're wrong because this is your burden of proof. If you can refute the alternatives and name them, since you're making this huge claim that if God does not exist, then moral values and duties do not exist, a deductive claim, sure. Which has to be deductive, not inductive.
Okay, let's do this. I made the case. What about the case that I made do you think is wrong?
That God is the only necessary thing to ground morality.
Okay, will we agree here it has to be something beyond just human opinion?
Well, the nominalists believe that mathematics is dependent upon human minds, but would that mean mathematics is wrong? So what if morality is grounded in the minds of humans?
Well, but I wouldn't agree with that. I wouldn't agree with that premise. I wouldn't say, well, yes, mathematics is grounded in human minds, and that's objective, so morality can somehow be analogous to that. I wouldn't agree.
If mathematics was dependent upon human minds, would 2 + 2 still equal 4, or are you going to try and say, no, it can't equal 4?
Well, it seems so absurd to say 2 + 2, that there's, a possible world where 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4, and that I would say that is absurd, but I would say it's because there's no possible world where mathematics can only be dependent on human minds.
By absurd, do you mean it just doesn't seem right to you, or there's an inherent logical contradiction? Because I would want to know what that logical contradiction is.
I think there would be. Well, I don't know if you would call it a contradiction so much as an impossibility. I would say, yes, it's impossible that there exists a world where 2 + 2 = 5, and well, no, I wouldn't say that's because of, and I would say it's also impossible.
Well, remember, that's not my claim that 2 + 2 could equal 5 if mathematics was.
Well, you said couldn't. You said couldn't equal 4.
No, okay, so would you say that it is impossible that if mathematics is rooted in, has its origins almost in human minds, that 2 + 2 could not equal 4, could fail to equal 4? Because that's a deductive claim, so no matter what, it has to be true. It's a necessary claim.
Well, if something like, okay, let me put it this way. Something that's dependent only on, say, human minds or human construction wouldn't be objective in that sense. So yes, if the claim 2 + 2 = 4 was only dependent and subject to human minds and human conceptions, then yes, it's not objective.
I'm not saying only. Could
be dependent on human minds?
Yeah.
That's not an argument.
No, I'm giving a hypothetical.
Well, because my point is it couldn't be.
So you're saying that if 2 + 2, that proposition is dependent upon human minds, wouldn't that also just be a genetic fallacy? If it just originate in human minds, therefore it can't be 2 + 2 = 4, or it could fail. It could not fail to be 2 + 2 = 4, just because it originates in human minds.
Yeah, I'm gonna be honest. I'm not sure what you're saying at this point.
Yeah, so I'm sort of giving this possibility. Okay, what if objective moral values and duties are dependent upon human minds, but they're not necessarily opinions? Just like 2 + 2 = 4 is not an opinion, but it has its origin in human minds. That's what the nominalist would say. So I'm trying to apply the same thing here. Because 2 plus 2 equals 4 is a necessary
you
truth.
could say, well, here, I don't, you could, that would be to make that it's ironic, because that's often the same mistake that's made in moral reasoning, is there's a shift between moral epistemology and moral ontology. You could say epistemically, statements like 2 plus 2 equals 4 have their origins in human minds, as in, obviously animals weren't making those statements, right? Obviously, there's degrees of mathematical reasoning in minds of chimpanzees, for example, but they didn't have, say, the language to say 2 plus 2 equals 4. So yeah, you could say statements like that epistemically have their origin in human minds, because we figured out how to number things and how to count things and how to, say, do mathematical equations. But of course, ontologically speaking, 2 trees and 2 more trees made 4 trees prior to human minds existing.
Well, isn't it just a description of our surroundings, but yet still objectively true?
Sure.
So I still think they would be necessary truths that are dependent upon human minds, because obviously 2 plus 2 equals 4, that proposition doesn't float out in space somewhere. It only exists in our minds.
Well, it depends specifically what you mean by human, or what was the term you just used?
Human mind?
No, it was a different one.
Or
human conception. I think you said human conception. Would that be right? The human conception being Yakitori, it depends. If you mean, say, the shape that we look at on a piece of paper and call the number 2, and the symbol we look at and call a plus sign, and the 2 lines we look at and call an equal sign, yeah, we invented those, but what they represent, we did not invent.
Interesting. Well, here's a different question I have for you. Why ought we follow what God's nature is? Because obviously, you didn't bring it up, but usually the theist argues that these are dependent upon God's nature, because God is not a liar or a murderer. Unless you're a Christian, then it's very clear in the Old Testament. But that's one other topic.
Yeah, just look at Paul Copan, everybody. Anyway, continue with your question.
He's been debunked. Why ought we follow God's nature?
Why ought we follow? Do you mean his commands or his nature? Because
his commands that come from his nature. Because I won't ask the youth of Pro Dilemma, because you just say, well, it's in his nature, and God commands what is his goodness or whatever.
Yeah.
Whatever word and oil on.
Yeah. So I agree with Tim Stratton here, where I take a combination of divine command theory and purpose theory. And so I would say it has a lot to do with our telos. So as you just said, morality is grounded in God's nature. And then when he creates us with a purpose in mind. So it's part of our design that we have a purpose. Just like, so for example, if you had a seed that was the seed of an oak tree, you would say it's a good seed insofar as it is able to successfully become and grow an oak tree. It would, otherwise, if it had defects or something, it wouldn't be good in that sense. Now, of course, that's not a moral goodness. When you talk about moral goodness, yes, we have moral goals and a moral purpose for which we are created. And again, you asked if it's grounded in God. So this isn't begging my worldview, because you were asking the question on my worldview. So yes, all my worldview, we're designed with a certain purpose in mind. And so we're good, we're moral, in so long as we line up with that purpose and we hit the target. There was, I think, I can't remember who pointed this out, in like the Greek, when you look at the New Testament in the Greek, the word good means to hit the target, whereas the word sin in the Greek means to miss the target. And then I would say the way we know what our moral purpose is through God's divine commands, because his divine commands reflect his nature. So that's why I'm like.
See, you say to the atheist, well, it can't be human flourishing because it's an is-ought fallacy, because it can't change, because it's just nature. Well, geez, God's nature can't change, so why isn't that just an is-ought fallacy? Because aren't we drawing an ought from an is? Just God's nature is, it cannot be otherwise.
Yeah, but God's nature has a moral dimension to it.
What do you mean by moral dimension?
So God, by definition, is the most good, the most kind, the most loving. There's moral aspects to that, right? Now, humans, if they're not created by God, don't have a moral dimension to them. So giving to charity would just be an is. It wouldn't be a moral dimension. Say, I don't know, allowing your children to be swept away by another animal would just be the way it is because there wouldn't be a moral dimension to them. So for God, there's a moral dimension to his actions. For humans, if atheism is true, there wouldn't be.
Well, yeah, obviously there has to be a way how God acts, but why call that good?
Why call what good?
I
mean,
God
God tells us it's good, right? By definition, if God is the most kind, he gets.
Yeah, but the flying spaghetti monster could tell you it's good and command rape or whatever.
Sure, it could tell us that, but moral spaghetti monster isn't, say, an infinite necessary being.
Interesting. What about God makes him necessary?
We're getting off the moral debate. I mean, yes, by definition, but you could also use Ed Fazer's arguments.
We're not getting off the debate because we're talking about your ontological grounding. And I don't know how you establish necessary existence for God, because then his morality depends upon that, because it's his nature. Because if he's not necessary, then geez, the youth probe just comes back in, and literally God could be a rapist by nature or something like that.
Oh, sure. For example, if the Christian God were something like a lesser God, if I conceived of some kind of pagan God who had to be created by some other necessary being, then sure, it could be whatever. But because he's not, because he is the necessary being,
you only can.
And goodness has ontological.
Why do you?
Go ahead.
So, this idea of and some God as the greatest conceivable being, people's great qualities and so on, those become subjective on an aesthetics. That becomes completely subjective on society, and it's just like at that point, then people, the barbarian pagans of Jamaic Rome, or the Jamaic pagans, I don't know if they were rapists, but also they don't hold to Western society since they fought with the Romans and so on. They could conceive of the greatest conceivable being and be like, oh, he could be a rapist or whatnot. So why should God be defined upon our subjective minds?
Well, hold on. Just because you said our subjective minds, our minds aren't subjective. Now you could say certain ideas we conceive of are subjective to us. And
well, is our reasoning subjective?
It depends on what you mean by subjective. If you mean individual to us, yeah, my reasoning is individual to me, but that doesn't mean it's not based on, say, objective principles of reasoning. So I'd say the principles of reasoning are objective. Now, how I apply it to my own arguments, you could say it has some subjective elements to it.
Yeah, so my case for why reasoning would most certainly be subjective is we all have different end goals and purposes that we most likely create for ourselves or are given to us, even by the telos there that you were talking about. And reason can easily work in accordance with those ends.
Sure.
But that would be subjective in that way. Well, if it's subjective, we all should be coming to the same conclusions.
Because that's to make two huge mistakes. Number one is the genetic fallacy to say that because
I'm not saying your beliefs are false.
Well, but it is a kind of a genetic fallacy to say because I can, say, point out the motives behind a certain, say, process of reasoning, that invalidates the conclusion. Because even if you're not saying the conclusion is definitely false, you're still trying to invalidate it by saying, well, we can't trust the conclusion because look at the motives behind the reasoning. So it's still a genetic fallacy. You don't have to be saying it's false. You just have to be trying to invalidate it.
My point is that the reasoning is subjective, not that the beliefs are false themselves.
Which would by definition invalidate the conclusion. So if you're saying you can't trust the process by which the conclusion comes about, then you can't trust the conclusion. So it's still the genetic fallacy.
I'm saying it should be less shaky. But it doesn't mean that because
that would be so the second point I want to bring up is to say that if, say, principles of reason or to take Tom Jump's favorite example, principles of science were somehow objective, that they by definition should change the minds of people. That's to just completely ignore what a human being is like. Whether that the fact that we do, to your own point kind of caves in on itself here, where of course we have biases, of course we have motives, of course we have reasons for wanting to believe certain conclusions over others. So just to say that by definition our minds would get changed by good evidence or good reasoning is just to not recognize what a human being is like.
Yeah, and to me, going off your argument there, I'm not agreeing with it per se, but to say that because we conclude that certain things are right and wrong from our own subjective standpoint, that they somehow can't be objectively right. That seems to me to be the genetic fallacy.
Can you repeat the last point? Why is it the genetic fallacy?
Because I'm reasoning to certain moral points, but obviously it's subjective. And how weren't you saying before that it can't depend upon human minds or human opinion?
Well, no, I didn't say you couldn't depend on human mind. No, okay, this is an important distinction. You can't depend on human minds as an objective grounding for morality. Now, you certainly can depend on human mind to some extent, right? Because you got to question everything and put everything to the test. To an extent, epistemically, you could say depend on human minds to come to correct moral principles. Like, we certainly are capable of reasoning to correct moral principles, but that's not the same thing as being an objective grounding for those things. Just like you could trust human minds by and large to say, look at a bunch of different mathematical equations, since you brought up that example, and point out which ones are true and which ones, okay, this is a bad equation because it never gives us the right answer. And we can do all these things, and we can say, oh, the human mind is very reliable in citing which equations are good. But that wouldn't be the same thing as grounding the ontology of mathematics in human minds. That's just a completely different category.
Well, why can't I still don't follow why it can't be grounded in humans?
And which one, morality or mathematics?
Morality, and mathematics, but focus on morality.
Well, the same reason it can't. The same reason mathematics couldn't be. You can't have different people inventing their own principles of mathematics that could contradict one another, because that's what you have with morality. You have, I mean, you brought it up. People who in their societies maybe think rape is good, or maybe think murder is good.
People internally don't want things to be done to themselves, so it's just like, why can't that be the grounding rule? And that originates in humans.
Well, because that's not universally true by any stretch of the imagination.
Wouldn't you argue from C.S. Lewis's? Wouldn't you argue from C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man that before the 20th and 21st century that universally almost culture has held to the golden rule? Because I know law apologists who do that.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, so I think C.S. Lewis, I really like C.S. Lewis's conclusion arguments on those things. I think apologists that tend to make that argument overstate their case to a bit, because I would say for most societies, for most of human history, they held to kind of a quasi-golden rule where it applied inwardly to their family and their tribe. But if you start talking about another tribe outside yours, certainly they didn't consider the golden rule to apply largely to other people. And there was a point you made earlier that I was going to address, but I can't. Oh, right. You asked why can't it just be based on the fact that most people wouldn't have it done to them. First of all, that's not true. If you look at things like skin stretching or certain things where people somehow found nobility and say, not nobility, I would say, but, there was just wide practices on, say, self-mutilation to a huge extent. Or, even jihad in Islam, right? They would have themselves blown up for the greater good. So that's certainly not a universal principle. Well, but even if you do just say,
because they believe they're doing it for God. Funny enough.
Okay, side marker though. I want to stay on the point, because the point is that's still what I said earlier, which is a naturalistic theory assuming a moral principle that isn't actually inherent on the theory. So you're just assuming we ought listen to the victims. Why assume we ought listen to the victims?
Well, why ought assume we should follow God? God's nature, just because he is a certain way?
No, I gave an argument for that. We have a telos, and he expresses what he wants from us, what our purpose is through his divine commands.
But
he's a proper authority. He's a proper authority, right? I don't care how many. One human is not a proper authority to another human, and so you simply, or even if say you got a group of people, a group of atheists, and say, hey, we all base our morality. Michael Shermer was the leader. We all base our morality on what you ought not do to a victim, or put yourself in the victim's shoes and then make a decision. That's not a proper authority to tell the rest of humanity how to behave. God is.
Why?
God, because he created us.
But now you said
and
his
owner
divine
of the universe,
purpose.
he's the owner of all creation. He's the owner of us. Go ahead.
He's the owner of us, so slavery.
I mean, we're not his slaves. I use that term, we're not merely property. But yes, God has authority over us. He's sovereign over us. We belong to him. Right? The word own isn't the perfect one because we're not property, we're persons. But yes, we do belong to God.
Well, you could still be someone's property and be considered a person. They just be devaluing your value as that person, like God does in the Old Testament many times. But you say that, and then slavery would somehow be wrong. But yet God owns my soul.
I meant property in the mere sense of, say, being an object that one owns, an inanimate object that one owns, and then, yeah, unfortunately, yeah, we're gonna have to do a part 2 because we're out of time. You want to go into the God and slavery thing, but real quick, okay, I'm gonna take the names away, come out of character real quick so we can wrap this up. What would you say? Because right before we went on air, we went live, you mentioned to me that you didn't know what position you were going to take as an atheist. So what would you say you were trying to do once we got into the thick of it?
Well, I didn't have a coherent argument because they usually don't have a selection of arguments to use. They just go back and forth.
You're good at being pretty slippery and trying to throw curveballs.
Oh, I can be, because that's the type of person I am. I'll be a clever atheist.
Well, okay. Is there anything you said that you felt you would have responded to better than I did respond to that you want to bring up?
I would probably go for some sort of, well, you also have the huge problem of consciousness, and this is why I don't separate other topics from morality and why I go into virtue ethics now, because like those who the nominalists, I think they have a problem with consciousness coming from matter in the first place. And if you get consciousness from somewhere external to that, then why not mathematics at that point? But I think there's other problems as well.
Yeah, and you did a good job. See, the thing is, you're right that it's all related. So, for example, I mean, one can ground morality in generic theism. I've kind of, as I've done these debates more and more, recognized that at the end of the day, it does come down to a little bit more than that. Like when you start asking why we should obey God, it's because we're made in the Imago Dei, which is inherent to a specific God, not just a generic theistic God. There's something else I was going to say. I can't remember it, though. Right. Oh, right. But for debate purposes, I'm not going to let one drag me off into defending, say, the necessity of God's existence. While it's relevant to the issue, it's often going to be used as a tack to not have to defend the position that the atheist was putting forward. And I think
they're not putting forward a position. Very few put forward moral realism or Sam Harris's flourishing. They usually just.
Well, Matt Dillahunty certainly does. It's a contradiction.
Well, yeah, it is game.
But it's a yeah.
I should use that.
Sam Harris, yeah, I would say he puts forth human flourishing. Even Michael Shermer, I would say, whether he wants to say he is or not, is putting forth a position that you ought consult the victim, because if you put yourself in their shoes and wouldn't have it done to you, then that is able to constitute as a universal moral principle. So that's a position he's putting forward. Now, Richard Dawkins technically isn't putting forth a position but he contradicts himself terribly, because he says, look, we all just dance to our DNA. There is no good, there is no evil, just blind, pitiless indifference. But then simultaneously has a bunch of moral complaints about how God behaves and Catholic priests and whatnot. So, so he just contradicts himself all over the place.
Well, with the subjective moralists who are atheists and complain about God in the Old Testament, as Converse Contender just super chatted, let's coexist together.
Yeah. All right. So I do want to do something real quick before we go. So as you guys may have known, I have a Subscribestar account. I only have one subscriber. That is Mr. John Dunphy. Hold on. I'm pointing the wrong way. There he is. Which I do appreciate that, brother. But so up until now, it's been just one $10 tier, and that's been meant to get you everything. I just recently today have updated it, so now there's, I think, 5 tiers. I have the overlay here, if I can find it to bring up. So there's the $1 tier, there's a $5 tier, $10, $25, and $50, and they all have different things. The $5 tier, I'll follow you on Twitter and Parler, which is kind of new, is more the conservative Christian version of Twitter. Me, Braxton Hunter, Tim Stratton, Jonathan Pritchett, a lot of us are hanging out on there now. And with the $25 a month one, yeah, after 2 months of that, you get it. the Unapologetic Apology shirt. It's a shirt that's unique to you. And then, of course, the last one is you get your name in the credits of videos and to be part of a monthly hangout, plus all the previous stuff. And so for incentive for that, I'm doing a book giveaway. So if you go back and look at the episode John and I did where we interviewed Hugh Ross, we discussed in depth this book. It's such a fantastic book. And I will be giving it away. And how you can enter that giveaway is to subscribe for any tier, even the dollar one. If you head on over to I have it.
So I'm getting another copy of Improbable Planet, most likely.
That's not funny. So if you head over to subscribestar.com/TUA, sign up for any one of the tiers, you're automatically entered for the book giveaway. So yeah, it's nice living, and we'll be doing more of those in the future. This will just be the first one. So yeah, so now if you can't afford to do that, I totally understand. What you can do for this channel for absolutely free is to subscribe to the YouTube channel, click notification bells because subscriptions don't mean a whole lot. Also click that like button. And probably you're seeing this on John's channel too, because we're live streaming to both. Please subscribe to his channel. He helps me out with a lot of stuff. Helps me interview people. And yeah, John, do you want to say anything before we go?
Yeah, so atheism needs to be spread through logic and reason.
This episode brought to you by, we're not going to do that, CTTA Apologetics.
There are a bunch of morons over at that organization.
They are. Mr. Jefferson Yakitori, thanks for being here. And
no problem. Yeah. I always love crushing people's mental crutches and their favorite.
Until next time, people, thank you so much for being here. And also one last thing I should say before I go is we've been doing a show every Thursday for the past couple months. Unfortunately, because of my work schedule, that's not going to be able to continue. Now, I'm hoping to still be able to continue to do live streams, but those will be in the afternoons primarily because I'll be at work during most of the day. And I will probably, depending on how things go, I'll try to be doing at least 2 a week because I'm not going to be able to commit to a specific day either. It's going to vary depending on other people's schedules and when I can have them on as guests. So yeah, that was the last thing I wanted to get you. I really appreciate